In this brief lecture, we will discuss semi-sedentary groups. Semi-sedentary peoples were unlike fully sedentary civilizations in that they did not permanently settle in one village and live there their entire lives. Instead, semi-sedentary groups resided in temporary villages and moved around, and they often lived in forest, and they inhabited much of the Atlantic coast of the Americas. So you can see here on the right, in Brazil there were many semi-sedentary groups that lived along the coastline and in the Atlantic forest. Semi-sedentary groups, their numbers didn't reach into the millions. Instead, there were several thousand members of these groups. And they built villages, but they were small villages, and they would only live in them temporarily. And one of the key characteristics of semi-sedentary groups was that they practiced slash and burn agriculture. Sometimes this is called shifting agriculture or swidden agriculture. And it consisted of slashing the forest, letting it dry, and then burning it. And the reason why they did this was because by burning the forest, all the tissues and ashes would fall to the ground, and it produced a very rich soil, so they could cultivate their crops on that soil. And it was very rich and it produced very high yields. The problem was, however, after cultivating such land for several years, the soil would become depleted of its nutrients. So therefore, the semi-sedentary group would be forced to move to another part of the forest where they would build a new village, and they would live there for several years and start the cycle all over again. And it was really one of the big breakthroughs in all of these periods was the domestication of maize, of corn. Maize was a crop that had been domesticated about 10,000 years ago in Mesoamerica, and it was adopted by peoples all over the Americas. And another key characteristic of the semi-sedentary groups was that there was less social stratification between members of the group than there were in the civilizations. There just was not a lot of wealth to be able to divide these groups internally. Instead, they usually organized themselves according to gender. So the men, they would go out and hunt, and they would also fell the forest. Meanwhile, the women would often practice agriculture. One of the semi-sedentary groups that I want to discuss here was that of the Tupi. And Tupi was a language family, and the specific group I'll talk about here was the Tupinamba that you see depicted in the image. They lived all along the Atlantic coast of Brazil, the map that I showed you in the previous slide. Beginning around 400 AD, they came to dominate Brazil's entire coastline. They lived in villages of about 600 persons, and they were often in a state of warfare with their immediate Tupi neighbors. And as you can see from the image, they weren't very wealthy. They lived in these big huts all together, and they all slept in hammocks, and the word hammock actually comes from a Tupi word. As you can see, they would paint their bodies with body art. They'd also have many piercings. And they practiced agroforestry. They would manage and manipulate the forest for its food resources. They also gathered oysters, crabs, fish, and birds that were found in mangroves along the coast. And one of the main crops that they planted was called manioc. And it's kind of like a potato. And it was very nutritious. It grew in the ground, so it could be there several seasons without spoiling. And it provided a lot of calories for the Tupi. And actually today in Brazil, manioc is one of the staple foodstuffs of the population.
Another semi-sedentary group was that of the Taino peoples in the Caribbean, and actually they were quite diverse. Many were semi-sedentary, others were sedentary groups, but the point is that these people were evolving on their own before the arrival of the Spaniards, but all that would be interrupted and disrupted after 1492. And one point I want to make, because I'm not going to go into too much detail here about the Taino, is that semi-sedentary peoples, because their numbers were much smaller, did not survive colonialism and the conquest to the degree that the peoples in sedentary civilizations did. And this has to do with the violence of the conquest, the old world diseases that wreaked havoc on the semi-sedentary populations. Many of the people in the Caribbean also were enslaved. Others committed suicide because of cultural collapse. So it was a very traumatic event, and these semi-sedentary groups, they're not going to survive. Many of them are going to go extinct along with their culture in the early colonial period. One other semi-sedentary group to mention here was that of the Mapuche of Chile and Argentina. And again, I'm not going to go into detail about them. There are many other semi-sedentary groups I haven't mentioned. Many lived in the Amazon forest, for example. One thing I will say about the Mapuche, and you can read about them in the Chile Reader, along with many of the tribes in Brazil in the Brazil Reader. You can use sources in those readers on your final term paper, but I'll mention that again come April. One thing I'll say about the Mapuche is that they actually were able to resist Spanish colonialism better than other groups. And part of this had to do with the fact that they were on the southern frontier of the Spanish Empire, down there in the southern South America. So they resisted Spanish colonialism for many centuries, and actually later in the 19th century they would confront the Chilean state as well. But if you want to know more about the Mapuche, you can include them in your final term paper. So moving forward, we're now going to look at nomadic tribes in pre-Columbian Latin America.